How do you meld a novel about the legacy of the Vietnam War with the gritty underworld of contemporary Las Vegas? Vu Tran will join us to talk about his debut novel, Dragonfish.
And when I devised the letters, Susie's letters to her daughter, I think that's when I found the novel, because that became the emotional backstory for everyone's story in the novel.
Haven't heard of the short story writer Lucia Berlin? Ruth Franklin will be here to tell us why we should.
I wouldn't say whimsical, but the connections she makes are so random and surprising sometimes that there's a constant sense of delight that comes out of the stories.
Alexandra Alter will fill us in with the latest from the literary world. Greg Cowles has bestseller news, and we'll let readers and listeners give us their feedback on their favorite summer reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Vu Tran joins us now. He is the author of Dragonfish, reviewed by Chris Abani in this week's book review. Hi, Vu.
Hi, Pamela.
So you are speaking to us actually from from Breadloaf in Vermont.
That's right.
Which is an ideal place for writers. Are you working on another novel up there?
No, I'm unfortunately not yet. I'm a bit too distracted to work on new stuff at the moment, even though I know I should.
Well, this is your first novel, Dragonfish. How long were you working on it?
I guess about 5 years. I sold it unfinished in 2009, May of 2009, and I finished it January of 2014, the first draft. And so, yeah, I guess about 5 years I worked on it.
And before that, you published mostly short fiction.
Yes. I'd never written a novel.
You didn't have a novel in a drawer?
No. I mean, I have a 90 pages in a drawer. That was my first attempt, and it stalled. And so this was the first novel I've ever finished. And it was a terrifying process the entire time, I have to say.
And when did it come out?
It came out last week.
Last week, okay.
August 3rd.
So hopefully it's not quite so terrifying anymore. Tell us what the book is about.
I like to think of it as a novel about a bad relationship, about a bad marriage between an Oakland police officer, a white American police officer, and his Vietnamese wife. In the wake of, their divorce, and 2 years after that, he's kind of pulled back into her life because of her new husband, who is violent towards her. The main thrust of the novel, what I call the crime narrative, is him being forced into Las Vegas to find her because she has disappeared. The secondary narrative in the novel are these letters that the wife, a woman named Susie, writes to this daughter that she abandoned when she came to the States 20 years ago, and is a kind of explanation to her daughter of the reasons why she did that. And those are the two narratives that kind of swirl around each other. And I guess it's a story about immigration, but also about about marriage, why certain people can't stay together.
It's also in many ways a thriller and a crime novel and a noir. Did you think...
Very much so.
You wrote it consciously as sort of within that genre, or sort of hybrid of those genres?
Absolutely, yeah. The novel came out of a short story I was asked to write about Chinatown, Las Vegas. It was for this anthology called Las Vegas Noir. And that's the second chapter of the novel, which is basically Robert, my white protagonist, coming to Vegas to kind of get back at this new Vietnamese husband out of some sort of jealousy or nobility. And the novel came out of that. I wrote the short story in that a noir vein, very consciously. When I decided to turn it into a novel, I realized that crime narrative alone was not compelling enough for me. And I also didn't want to feel like I was borrowing from something inferior to make something superior, like borrowing from crime fiction to, write literary fiction. I just had to think of the novel, in its own terms, if that makes sense. But what I did realize is that the crime genre allowed me to do, especially with noir and crime, it's this idea of shadows and the surface of things versus the substance of things. It kind of overlapped with the immigrant novel that I was essentially writing, and the idea that immigrants have all these stories that they often are willing to share, but there are a lot of stories that immigrants are unwilling to share for various reasons. And I thought it was interesting the reasons why people do not want to share certain stories.
In this story, is that Susie's letters to her daughter?
That's right. Out of that comes a bad marriage, a man who wants, to connect with his wife and to have access to her emotionally and to her past, but she's unwilling to give him that access. That is one of the many reasons why their marriage fails. One of the reasons why a lot of her Susie's relationships fail.
So you wrote this short story, this Las Vegas noir story, for a collection. When did you decide, and how did you decide that was what you wanted to turn into a novel?
I was working on that failed novel. I was stuck on 90 pages, and I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm trying too hard on something that I'm not really enjoying. So I put that aside, and the thing that struck me about the short story is that there is a character in the short story who ends up recounting his time in the refugee camps after escaping Vietnam, the refugee camps in Malaysia, on the island of Pulau Bidong, which was where I was. I realized that in that story, there is a backstory, a kind of secondary narrative that would provide the crime narrative with an emotional foundation that would hopefully tie, emotionally at least, connect all the main characters to each other. Even my white protagonist, who is the outsider. And when I devised the letters, Susie's letters to her daughter, I think that's when I found the novel, because that became the emotional backstory for everyone's story in the novel.
And was this character Sonny?
Well, no, it was his son.
Sonny's son. Okay. Tell us about Sonny and his son, Junior, with the the Las Vegas characters from this story.
I think in terms of crime conventions, Sonny would be the villain, and his son would be a kind of like, henchman, and they're henchmen, various henchmen in the novel. But I think my idea was to present Sonny as a villainous and unsavory character. And this happens early in the novel. You find out that he chops off a man's hands, fingers actually, but he did so to protect his son, and that their relationship is not so much one of love, because his wife dies, and I think after that, he never gets over it. It's not so much of love, but it's one of mutual protectiveness and obligation, the roles that one plays in Vietnamese culture, for example. And I think a lot of Junior's behavior and a lot of Sonny's behavior in the novel is, this is the role I play, and this is what I must do in that role, protect my son or protect my father. As the villains, my hope and approach to their characters was to slowly and gradually complicate their characters so that their acts of villainy or acts that would seem morally wrong would be complicated as the story unfolds, and that the reader would keep changing their mind about them. That's what I was hoping for, and I wanted from the reader.
You mentioned earlier that Sonny spent time in a refugee camp that you spent time in?
Yes, that's right. A place called Pulau Bidong, which is right off the coast of Malaysia. I was there with my mother and my sister after we escaped Vietnam by boat. We were at the camp for, I believe, 4 months until my father, he was in the South Vietnamese Air Force, so he left as soon as Saigon fell. And he left Vietnam before I was born, about 5 months before I was born. So he had settled in Oklahoma, and he sponsored us from Oklahoma. This is 5 years after he left.
Why did he settle in Oklahoma?
Everyone always asks me that. Essentially, when he came to America, he was sponsored by a Catholic priest. I was raised Catholic, and he was sponsored by a Catholic priest in Kansas. And from Kansas, he had two brothers who had come as well, and they from there settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I believe because of Catholic church sponsors. Yeah.
How much did your experience as a refugee, as an immigrant, do you think, infiltrate this novel?
Inevitably infiltrates a lot of it. I think a lot of the basic premise of Susie and her daughter escaping Vietnam, by boat and then spending time on the refugee island. That basic premise comes from my own experience. In terms of, growing up as an immigrant, I think that sense of dislocation and outsidership, which I think everyone experiences on some level, right? But I definitely brought that to the table with a character like Mai, the daughter. But I also brought a lot of myself to Robert, the American police officer. I think I view myself as very American, and in many ways I'm an outsider to Vietnamese culture as well, to Vietnam. I brought a lot of my feelings of being on the periphery of things to Robert's character as well. That not also a sense of outsidership, but also need to kind of, gain access to that world. So a lot of me is in Robert as well.
You teach creative writing now at the University of Chicago. Do you find that these themes that occupy you in your own fiction are ones that your students are also trying to address as immigrants or refugees themselves?
I think so, yeah. At University of Chicago, there are a lot of immigrants or second-generation children of immigrants. I do see a lot of that. I have a lot of Chinese students, a lot of Indian students, and I do feel that they are confronting those kinds of, whether it's a sense of outsidership, like I said. Viet Thanh Nguyen, I had a student go to one of his readings, his novel The Sympathizer, and he had called it growing up and feeling as though he was a kind of spy. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the students bring that sentiment on some level to their work. Absolutely.
So any plans to go back to that 90-page pile in your drawer?
No. I've cannibalized a couple of scenes from it for this novel, actually. I think I will borrow certain passages, but I think that was very much a first novel and had a lot of naive first novel tendencies. I think it'll stay very snugly in my desk.
So we can properly refer to this as your second novel, and we'll look forward to your third.
That's right.
All right. Vu Tran, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Vu Tran is the author of Dragonfish, reviewed this week in the book review by Chris Abani. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we're going to talk about dead people?
Dead people. It's the hottest trend for summer.
You don't have to be alive to be a best-selling author.
No, not at all. In fact, you might have a better chance at it. We seem to be in the midst of this flood of posthumous publications by famous writers. And so far this summer, we've had previously unpublished works by Dr. Seuss, Shirley Jackson, Ayn Rand, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and there are more books on the way.
All right. What do we look forward to from people who are no longer with us?
Truman Capote has a collection of short stories coming out in the fall. There's a novel coming from Oscar Uelos, and then next year there'll be works by J.R.R. Tolkien and Pablo Neruda.
All right. You liked them when they were alive. You'll like them even more now. What's going on?
You might. I mean, it's interesting. It's probably just a coincidence. These things, come out all the time when scholars or literary estates go through the archives of writers, and sometimes critics say that they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. But whenever these books kind of come out in a cluster, there's usually a debate over how publishers should really handle these literary remains and whether some things are better left in the archives. Scholars and fans are often excited for more by their favorite authors, and they say, look, this tells us something about the person's creative process. Whether or not it's the apogee of their output doesn't really matter. We can see more from them and learn about their creative development. But there's always this uncomfortable feeling, or there often is, that comes with these works, which, you're reading them and you feel like, well, maybe this goes against the author's intent. Maybe they didn't want this out. Maybe this was left behind for a reason. And this summer, with some of these books that have come out, some critics have been pretty tough on books, particularly in our paper.
Yes.
One recent example is Let Me Tell You, a collection of 56 short stories and other pieces by Shirley Jackson, who died in 1965 and is probably best known for The Lottery. So 40 of these works had never been published before, and the book was put together by her children. They went through her archives at the Library of Congress and came up with these unpublished works. And, a lot of fans were enthusiastic, but our critic, Dwight Garner, said that this collection really scrapes the bottom of the jar and that its publication does no favors to anyone who wishes to make the case for Miss Jackson's oeuvre.
Although Paul Theroux loved it in the book on the cover of the book review. So
That's true. I mean, there have been diverging opinions.
One that seems to be fairly anonymous, though, is the new Ayn Rand, quote-unquote new Ayn Rand, which Michiko Kakutani did not enjoy.
She did not enjoy it. In fact, she said that quote, "The reader instantly understands why this novel, written in 1934, was set aside by Rand and not published until now."
It must be a hard thing, too, for the editors because the editorial process is usually such a back and forth, and some editors are more hands-on than others, but generally writers will have the final say over how their work appears. And in this case, the editors are operating on these manuscripts in a vacuum.
That's right. And often the impulse is, well, since we don't know what exactly they would want and we can't ask for changes, let's just publish it as is. And I think that's why you sometimes see things coming out that aren't as polished as what the writer might have wanted.
So for all you doubters who wonder what editors do and whether it's worthwhile, here's your proof.
That's right.
Okay. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks.
Ruth Franklin joins us now to talk about Lucia Berlin's Selected Stories, a manual for cleaning women. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Pamela.
So many people here will not be familiar with the name Lucia Berlin. Who was she?
Well, I have to confess, I was sort of in the same boat before this book landed in my lap. I guess I'd heard her name, but I had never read the stories in any kind of coherent way before. She was a writer who kind of lived on the margins of American literary society. She lived out in Albuquerque, I think in Oakland, California. She had non-traditional jobs like the cleaning women of the title.
She was a cleaning woman.
She was actually a cleaning woman. And
her and David Sedaris, well, I guess he was a cleaning man. But anyway.
She followed a career trajectory that isn't what we have come to expect from our writers. And she wrote these, really wildly original stories that came out of it.
And where did she publish?
She published, it seems, in little magazines. Apparently she was in the small magazine, The Noble Savage, that Saul Bellow published for a little while. And then her stories were published by small presses. And if I'm not mistaken, this is her first major press book.
So this is coming from Farrar, Straus and Giroux.
Right.
Did she write any novels, or did she work purely in the short story form?
I think that she only wrote short stories, but I'm not 100% certain about that.
We should say that she was born in 1936 and died in 2004, so this is coming 11 years after her death.
My sense is that, that she's one of these writers who is tagged with the sort of unfortunate term writer's writer. Is
that the kiss of death?
I guess it's the kiss of popular success death anyway, in that, it kind of implies that this is a, fascinating and interesting writer whom you probably don't want to read if you're not a writer. And I think, it couldn't be farther from the truth. For most people it's applied to, and certainly not for Berlin, who's very much down to earth and very kind of, these stories are extremely accessible on the surface and then yield a lot of food for thought once you start looking at them more deeply.
Do we often use the term writer's writer when we're talking about writers who other writers admire on the sentence level in particular?
I think that's right. Or writers who, other writers admire but who we think are sort of out of the mainstream taste for one reason or another. And I guess, one reason that Berlin might be thought of that way is that she does write about these figures like herself who are kind of on the margins, alcoholics, women, and people who hang out in laundromats, and delinquent teenagers, and other people who are not generally thought of as literary subjects.
Just looking at the brief outline of her life story on the book jacket, it sounds like she did have quite an interesting life growing up in western mining towns during her early years, and then as a teenager living in Santiago, Chile. What else do we know about Berlin's life?
I think just that it was very itinerant. One of her sons, she had 4 sons, apparently with several different husbands. And one of her sons says that they moved something like every 9 months when he was growing up. And so you have a sense also from her fiction of this kind of constant restlessness, of a soul that is sort of looking for a home everywhere and can't really find it.
She also was an alcoholic for much of her life. And is that a theme in her work?
Definitely. A lot of these stories are about women who are alcoholics portrayed in the most gruesome, unromanticized detail.
Did she only start writing after she got sober?
No, I don't think so.
So they're the drunken stories.
It seems like she was writing from a very early age and just kind of kept it up sporadically her whole life.
And what's in this collection? Is this all her work, or is this selected?
This is selected from the various collections that came out during her life.
Did the editor, Stephen Emerson, does he discuss how he picked the stories?
Not in a systematic way. I think he just picked what he admired.
And you said that you felt like they were linked and that they all were very clearly coming from a particular sensibility.
I would say that. I mean, they're certainly not about the same characters all the time, and they don't give an impression of monotony. But one does have a sense that the women, because it's almost always women who do narrate these stories, that these women are all, if not exactly the same person, then sort of versions of the same person at different stages of her life or when different things have happened to her.
And are they mostly told in the first person?
They are, yeah.
Did you have a favorite story?
I guess I have a few favorite stories.
Tell us about one of them.
The title story is it's funny, these stories are very hard to describe, actually, because they're written in this style that's both very direct and very elusive. And so the title story describes a cleaning woman as she goes about her rounds over, a few days or a week or something like that, and describes, as the story unfolds, she's describing not only the houses of the people she is cleaning for, but also details about her own life start to come out in little bits and pieces.
Read us a passage that captures her style.
Okay, I'm going to read a little passage from another story about a cleaning woman. So that shows you a little bit about what I was trying to explain about how the narrators are the same but different in different stories. This one is called Mourning, Mourning. And it begins, I love houses, all the things they tell me. So that's one reason I don't mind working as a cleaning woman. It's just like reading a book. I've been working for Arlene at Central Reality. Cleaning empty houses mostly, but even empty houses have stories, clues. A love letter stuffed way back in a cupboard, empty whiskey bottles behind the dryer, grocery lists. Please pick up Tide, a package of green linguine, and a 6-pack of Coors. I didn't mean what I said last night.
You say in your review that the mantra of the collection might be, all pain is real. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a line from one of these stories, and I guess what I meant is that the stories are very much focused around people's pain, both emotional pain and physical pain. That is approached sort of, almost in a vivisectionist kind of way. It's in one of the stories, the narrator works in an emergency room, and so you see kind of all the blood and guts of the human condition. And in stories like that, it's very literal. But these are also stories about women who have suffered a lot in various ways, as children being abused by their parents, or as adults who are being abused by their partners or by law enforcement or just by life in general. They're very much about life suffering. But I don't mean to make them sound like too much of a downer, because they're not. As you can see from the passage I just read, they're sort of I wouldn't say whimsical, but the connections she makes are so random and surprising sometimes that there's a constant sense of delight that comes out of the stories.
Lydia Davis wrote the foreword to the collection, and you mentioned that you didn't read her foreword until after you had read the stories. Why did you decide not to read the foreword?
It's funny. I mean, when you're a critic, you're used to approaching everything in a very methodical, systematic, I'm going to write about this kind of way. And something about this book, when I started looking at it, made me feel like I really wanted to approach these stories as a reader, as a human being first, rather than with all the critical acumen turned up to 11 or
Right.
however we usually do it.
Do you think that was because you weren't familiar with Lucia Berlin's work, that you wanted to kind of maintain that state of freshness?
Or a kind of wonderment. It felt like because these stories didn't seem to come from a context that I was familiar with, I just wanted to approach them as they were and kind of allow them to explain themselves to me rather than look for lots of explanations elsewhere.
And so Lydia Davis, who wrote the foreword, is also known for her short fiction. What did you learn reading her foreword after you had read the book?
Well, I learned, the details of Berlin's biography, which I hadn't been familiar with before, which, do seem important in some way, I suppose, to authenticate the stories, if, we can use that word. I think they do gain something from knowing that they are based in her own life experience. That said, I would have assumed that even without reading this introduction, because they feel so directly drawn from life that you could hardly come to any other conclusion about them.
I just want to ask one more question about the foreword, because you've written forewords yourself, and I imagine that that's its own particular challenge. When you're writing them, do you think about, is this something that the reader is going to want to read before they read the book, or is it something they're going to want to flip to after? I always just think it's such a tricky thing, how much to cover, how much to reveal in the foreword to a book.
That's an interesting question. I don't think about whether the reader is going to read it before or after the rest of the book, and I wonder what most readers do with the foreword. I'm probably going to assume that they likely skip it altogether.
Yeah. I used to hate, as a reader of classics, when you would read the foreword of the introduction and would reveal the entire plot, assuming that people knew the story and that this scholar was taking an opportunity, or literary critic, to give their take on the full unfolding of events.
I guess that's a good argument for always reading the foreword last, just in case the foreword writer has no compunctions about spilling the whole plot.
So one last question for those encountering Lucia Berlin for the first time. It's hard to persuade someone to pick up a story collection of a writer now dead who you aren't familiar with. What would you say to them to sort of persuade a person who might appreciate this book?
I would say that these stories are truly not like anything that most readers have ever encountered before, and that's an experience as a reader that you don't often have.
All right. Well put. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you, Pamela.
That was Ruth Franklin. This week she reviews A Manual for Cleaning Women, Selected Stories by Lucia Berlin. John Williams joins me now to represent our readers. Hi, John.
Hi, Pamela.
We asked people on Twitter this week to let us know what the best book they've read so far this summer has been. What did we learn?
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're already wrapping up the season a little bit. We learned that people read a lot this summer because we got a lot of replies to this, and some of them were expected. Ta-Nehisi Coates' book Between the World and Me was mentioned. That's a #1 bestseller. So was Paula Hawkins' The Girl on the Train, which is an ongoing bestseller. A tweeter named Eva Blaser said that she read at 6 p.m. Sunday night till 6 a.m. Monday morning with a few hours of sleep in between, so in one sitting. 2 people on Twitter mentioned a book called A Man Called Ove by Frederick Backman, which I hadn't heard of. Dave Brown said that it will be hard to beat as my favorite book of the year, and Stephanie Howell said it won me over and broke my heart. So I looked this book up, and it's by a Swedish author. It's about a grumpy man whose world is changed when a group of rowdy neighbors moves in next door.
So there are other Oves in Scandinavia other than Karl Knausgaard.
Yes.
It's funny. I heard also some books that are familiar from the bestseller list, All of the Light We Cannot See, the Anthony Doerr. Victoria Adele said she's reading Uprooted by Naomi Novik, a fantasy novel we reviewed earlier this year, and Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, who was mentioned several times.
There were a couple of people who, Lowry Jackson and Kristen Pounders among them, who named Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman as their favorite read this summer, which I found interesting since it's had such a divided response. And Elizabeth Gehagen, a writer herself, wrote that A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin was her favorite. She called the stories hilarious, devastating, and gorgeous. And of course, he talked about those stories earlier on this podcast with Ruth Franklin.
Another previous podcast book, A God in Ruins by Kate Atkinson, was mentioned by Hope Dellen and a couple of other people. Michael Takens, who works in the business, said Old Filth, which I finally read after years of people recommending it to me, which led to a flurry of responses on Twitter from other writers. Tom Beer of Newsday, he reviews for them, said, "I guess now I have to read it too."
That's a good one. It's appropriate given the season that a couple of people mentioned William Finnegan's new surfing memoir, Barbarian Days.
I got that too. And I also saw Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie got a number of mentions. And Garth Greenwell and Cara Blue Adams both plugged A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, which of course was just named to the long list for the Man Booker Prize.
Right.
And one last big seller, Station 11. Someone who goes by the name of Beyonce Pad Thai recommended Station 11, but she wasn't alone. I heard that frequently.
People who had waited for the paperback, it's out now, so they're getting to it.
So since we're almost done with summer, we do have a big summer fiction issue this week. We can then move on and ask people next time about what they're looking forward to for fall.
It's always a big season.
All right. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pamela.
Greg Cowles is here with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new on the list?
There's a lot of churn on the hardcover fiction list this week. It has reached a rolling boil, as pasta makers like to say. But nothing so far has proved capable of displacing Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee, which remains at number 1 in its 4th week on the list. The new fiction titles are Magic Shifts by Alona Andrews. Fans know there is no Alona Andrews. There's Andrew Gordon and Alona Gordon, a husband and wife team who write urban fantasy together, and this is the 8th book in their Kate Daniels series. Then at number 13, Deadly Assets by W.E.B. Griffin and his son William E. Butterworth IV. This book is the 12th in their Badge of Honor series about the Philadelphia PD. Then new at number 11, Alice Hoffman, the Boston area magical realist, has a novel called The Marriage of Opposites. It does incorporate some magical realism, some folklore, but mostly it's a historical novel set on St. Thomas that looks at the Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro in his youth and his mother. Then just above that on the list, new at number 10, another urban fantasy novel by Sherilyn Kenyon. The 26th novel in her Dark Hunter series is called Dragonbane. That's new at number 10. Then at number 8, an unacknowledged forebear of the urban fantasy genre, maybe Haruki Murakami, who mixes hard-boiled prose with these otherworldly events, is on the list with a book that's really 2 books. His first 2 novels, published in Japan in the 70s and never before released in the United States until now. Those books are called Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973. They are being released here as one volume just called Wind Pinball. That's new at number 8. And then finally, the last new title on the list this week is by James Patterson and Michael Ledwidge. They are the team who brought us Zoo. But before that, Michael Ledwidge was James Patterson's co-writer on the Michael Bennett series about the NYPD. They are back with the 8th book in that series. It's called Alert, new at number 3.
At some point, you're going to have to look, Greg, at how many weeks a year there is not a new book by James Patterson on the fiction bestseller list.
I bet it's single digits.
That's right. All right. What's going on with nonfiction?
In nonfiction, there are just 3 new titles this week. Down at number 13, the science writer Susan Casey has a book called Voices in the Ocean, which looks at dolphin intelligence, dolphin consciousness, and kind of the history of dolphin research. It goes back. She has written a couple of previous books also focused on marine biology and marine science.
And surfing.
And surfing, as a matter of fact. She did a book called The Wave that was about rogue waves deep out in the ocean.
I like to think of all her books as sort of taking place in nice weather.
She also had a book about the great white shark and sharks in general. Well, she's a good summer author for the list. Then at number 5, the mixed martial artist Ronda Rousey has written a biography called My Fight, Your Fight. That book actually was published in May, and it's made big inroads on our monthly sports list, but it has not hit the general nonfiction list until this week. It was probably propelled there in part by comments that Rousey made this week saying that she could beat Floyd Mayweather, the boxer, in a no-rules fight. That autobiography is written with the help of Maria Burns Ortiz, new at number 5 on the list.
And Fighting Words at number 1?
Fighting Words at number 1. The talk radio host Mark R. Levin has a hot-blooded libertarian manifesto, Plunder and Deceit, new at number 1, which knocks Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me out of the top spot down to number 2.
And Plunder and Deceit, we describe it as the talk radio host urging young Americans to resist the statist masterminds who, he says, are burdening them with debt and inferior education.
Yeah, it's basically a book written to the millennial generation, arguing that they should adopt his libertarian views.
Very different messages from young people from Ta-Nehisi Coates and Mark Levin at the top of our bestseller list.
Yes.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.